there, that's beautiful flowers there.
And if you release
And so if we release that labeling and just look at the impermanence, that can be very helpful. The deeper level, of course, is to experientially realize we're labeling. That's emptiness. Right. Just move on a little bit. Now, one of the reasons this view is very difficult to appreciate is because we are stuck in what's called the two extremes. And the two extremes are existence and non-existence. And for us, existence means independent existence. And of course, non-existence is the view that nothing exists, of course, which is the view of nihilism. And for us now, there only seems to be these two possibilities. Either there is this real, independent, functioning world, or there's no me and no world. Because the only me and world that has appeared to us is one that seems to exist independently. We've only ever had this experience. And so therefore, we don't entertain a possibility that things could exist in another way. Because that's there, they're there. And that's how they exist. And what we're doing here is, through the Vipassana practice of emptiness, we are undermining this mistaken view. So our reflection and meditation on emptiness is coming to understand and realise there is nothing exists independently. But for us, when we start to do this reflection and meditation, we mistakenly interpret an experience of emptiness as nothing exists. So it's very common in meditation that we flip to the extreme of nihilism, non-existence, and usually together with that comes a lot of fear, existential fear, like I'm going out of existence or I don't really exist. So if we're doing emptiness meditation and fear is arising, usually that's a very good sign. It means we are correctly investigating and correctly coming to see there's no independent me here. But we're misinterpreting that not finding to mean there's no me at all. So if we're having that fear experience, we can do a few things. One, of course, is we can ask the question, who's having the fear? Because if fear is arising, that proves you exist. Because if you didn't exist, there can be no fear. And the other thing we can do, of course, is to reflect and contemplate this view of emptiness better, understanding that emptiness does not mean nothing exists. Emptiness means nothing exists independently, which means things exist dependently. So the antidote to this extreme is to reflect on dependent arising. So if we can better understand and appreciate that things do exist, they exist depending on causes and conditions and parts, and particularly understand that things exist depending on labelling, they exist within our conceptual framework, then that can help us to overcome the extreme of nihilism. And so, as I mentioned, we're stuck in these two extremes. And for us now, there's two choices, two options. That either there is a real independent functioning world, or there's no world. And so often when we begin this view of emptiness, we feel that emptiness and functioning world are contradictory. And if things are empty, they can't function. And if they function, they can't be empty. And I even hear sometimes people who maybe have studied Buddhism for quite some time still say things like, oh, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. That's nihilism. That's a complete wrong view of emptiness. The right view of emptiness is, because things are empty, everything matters. That's the correct view. Because things are empty, they can function. And because there's a functioning world that must be empty. That's the correct view. Because if this existed independently, if it had a inherent nature of being a cup, if it was a cup from its own side, if it had a unique nature of being a cup, it means you couldn't create it, it couldn't change, you couldn't destroy it, it couldn't function. But because this has no unique nature from its own side of being a cup, it means it can change, it can function, you can create it, you can destroy it. So this is the measure of having a good understanding of the view of emptiness. The measure is, again, because things are empty, they can function. And because things function, they must be empty. That's the correct view of emptiness. And this is very nicely put by Nagarjuna in that text I mentioned. He says, that which arises dependently and relatedly is explained as being empty. And that which is empty is dependently designated. This is the middle way path. Now, as I've mentioned a few times already, but it's good to maybe mention again, is often when certain concepts are presented in Buddhism, particularly concepts that are not so easy to understand, often lots of analogies are given. A simple analogy to help us to understand a more profound topic. And here in the topic of emptiness, there are many analogies used. And the one that I find particularly helpful is this analogy of a dream that I've mentioned a number of times already. So just to go through that analogy again. Now when we're dreaming, in the dream, there appears to be an independent dream me here, and there appears to be an independent dream world out there. And then, of course, if we see something pleasant in the dream, we have a lot of craving and attachment, something unpleasant, a lot of aversion, maybe fear, anxiety. But if in the middle of the dream, suddenly we become lucid, so we suddenly realize in the middle of the dream, this is a dream, there will still appear to be an independent dream me, there'll still appear to be an independent dream world out there, but now because we're lucid, we will realize this dream world is deceptive, and that this dream world is actually a product of our mind. Which means if we encounter something pleasant in the dream, it would become very difficult to have craving and attachment for it. And it would become very difficult to have aversion for anything unpleasant, and we would enjoy our dream a hell of a lot more. So this view of emptiness is saying that our waking life is like a dream. Because in our waking life, there appears to be an independent me here, there appears to be an independent objective world out there, which means when we encounter something pleasant, attachment, unpleasant, aversion, big mess. But if we become lucid in our waking state by realizing emptiness, there will still appear to be an independent me, there'll still appear to be an independent world out there, but because we're lucid now through realizing emptiness, we will directly realize these appearances are deceptive. And therefore, you will find that if something pleasant appears, it would be very difficult to have attachment to it, very difficult to have aversion to unpleasant things, and we'd enjoy our waking life a lot more. So that's an analogy that I find quite helpful. One last thing, and then maybe some questions we can do. As I mentioned, in our experiences, we draw lines, we create objects, and then give them names. We must do that, nothing wrong with that, otherwise we can't function. The problem is, again, we turn these lines into boundaries. We see the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things. Now, generally, in most of our experiences, the first line we draw is we draw a line around here and we create the experiencer, because there's single experience. And in single experience, there are two aspects: experiencer, experienced. And we need to distinguish those two aspects, otherwise we can't function. And I think a newborn baby has a very difficult time to even do that. So we correctly draw a line, create me, experiencer, but the problem is we then turn that line into a boundary. We contract around the me part of experience and split ourselves off from the experienced and see ourselves as independent of the experienced. And that is called self-grasping. But this is completely illogical. For example, is this big? Is it big?
No.
It's not?
Compared to fingers.
So you can't have big on its own. Big can only exist relative to small. You can't have big and small. It doesn't make any sense. Just like that, you can only have up with down, in with out. Just like that, you can only have me relative to not me. You can only have subject relative to object, experiencer relative to experienced.
What about good and bad?
So what we do when we're grasping onto an independent me, that view of me is exactly like saying this is big. It's completely illogical. It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, what we're doing is we are contracting around the me part of the experience. We're splitting ourselves off from the experienced and seeing ourselves as completely independent of experienced. And as a result, of course, as we saw, we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and so forth. And very often in our behaviour, this contraction and splitting off is very strong. This self-grasping is very strong. We often have a strong sense of me doing this, me saying that, me going there, with this self-grasping. And the stronger the self-grasping, the more out of sync we are with the interdependent nature of reality, the more we fight and struggle against the interdependent nature of reality, and the more we do that, the more we have mental afflictions and suffering, and the more suffering we cause on the people around us. But sometimes in our behaviour, this self-grasping is not as strong. And that often happens when we're more focused on the activity rather than the agent who's doing the activity. For example, when we're absorbed in reading a good book, absorbed in watching an interesting program on TV, absorbed in solving a problem at work. On those occasions, we're more focused on the activity rather than the agent. And what we notice in those occasions is things seem to flow quite well, time seems to go quite quickly, because we are more in sync with reality, because we're not so strongly contracting and out of sync with reality. And this is very much even more highlighted in people who've developed high level of focus in their activities. People like professional musicians, professional athletes, who spent thousands of hours of training in their activity, have developed a high level of focus in that activity, so much so that often when they do that activity, they report that they're in the flow state, in the zone. Even to the point where sometimes they say, well, there was no sense of me, actually. There was just the music playing. There was just the sporting activity happening. Not only that, but in those occasions, they report peak performance, optimum performance. Why? Because we're much more in harmony with the interdependent nature of reality. But that's only coming through a reduction in grasping through concentration. So here in Vipassana, of course, we're taking that further. We are cutting the grasping through wisdom, through Vipassana practice of emptiness. And if we can cut it completely, that grasping, then we'll come to realise there's no independent me, no independent world. we'll realize there's not one single boundary in the entire universe. Because as long as we see boundaries, particularly the boundary here and there, the boundary that seems to separate me from everything else, as long as we have that false grasping, then it's going to be difficult to fully develop love and compassion, because that's their problem. It's not my problem they're suffering. Whereas if we realize there's no boundary, then what you will find is that if suffering arises, the natural response is compassion, regardless of whether it's this body or that body. Not really much difference. So what you'll find, a measure that our emptiness practice is really starting to go a little bit deeper, is that from emptiness in daily life, if we really have a very deep experience of emptiness, and while that's still affecting our mind in daily life, you'll find much more spontaneous love and compassion arising. That's a measure that our emptiness practice is going well. Because love and compassion is the natural expression of emptiness. Okay. Any quick question before we break for lunch?
You answered mine.
Just the name of the book you mentioned, you take the text from, in philosophical Buddhist words.
Anagarjuna? Yeah. It's in Sanskrit, it's called Mula Madhyamika Karika. Sometimes translated as fundamental wisdom of the middle way, but it's not so easy. There have been a couple of translations, in fact a fairly recent translation which I think is a good translation, but the thing is it's all in verse form, so it's not, as a beginner it's very difficult to follow because it's all very short verses. And I think there have been a couple of commentaries on that have been translated that may be helpful, but of course the best is to get some teachings on this, on the Nagarjuna. But yeah, it's in a very short verse form, so it's not like a long, easy explanation to follow. It's very short, pithy statements, so as a beginner it's quite difficult to get into.
So as a beginner, to practice Vipassana, it's what we did today?
So I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow morning, but the short answer, of course, is that, and I mentioned here...
Of course, Shamatha.
Yeah, Shamatha for sure. If we don't do any Shamatha, I would say that Vipassana... I mean, if we're naturally more focused, okay, but for most of us, agitated, dull, distracted, we can spend a lot of time in Vipassana and not really get much out of it. But if we have more focus, clear mind, then we can start to get some traction in Vipassana practice. And what can be very helpful is impermanence as a starting point, particularly with respect to the body, to get out of that sort of conceptual mind. So that either the body scan or observing the reality of the body, that can be a good place to start. And also, what can be helpful if we have done shamatha practice of observing mind or resting awareness is what we're going to do this afternoon, the Vipassana practice of what's called nature of mind. That can also sometimes be a little bit more productive than the approach we've used looking for the person. Although for some people they find this the best. So there's a couple of different things we can do, but we'll talk more about that later. Yeah, last question, then we need to break.
Can you Theravada, they accept the idea that the whole depends on the parts.
Right.
Why?
But the whole can be found amongst the parts. The whole is the collection of the parts.
Yes, so why won't that lead them to understand that it's empty? And based on this very...
Because, for example, in classical physics, they all accept this, no? Even the super brilliant scientists in classical physics, does that lead them to understand there's no objective reality out there? I don't think so.
But even this basic logic, they wouldn't... they've come to a very high realization. They wouldn't realize that you can't say it's neither one nor two, and it's neither one of those, then one.
So the difference, of course, here is that as a scientist, it's intellectual. So you can be a brilliant scientist. I think a really brilliant scientist might start to make that move, but most won't, unless they're in quantum physics, then they've got a different perspective. But here, if if someone is in Theravada realizing impermanence, forget about no self, just impermanence, if they're a bit sharp, intuitive, yes, that can lead them into that, into emptiness. Exactly. It can. It's not automatic, but if they're a bit sharp-minded, they could move in that direction. Whereas here we're explicitly investigating that. Whereas they're explicitly investigating impermanence, and due to that experience, that could lead them to realise a deeper reality of emptiness. Yes, that's true. Okay, let's break there for lunch. Come back at 2, and then we'll continue our meditation and discussion here. A few things more to say yet.